let's welcome our next speaker, Scott Humphries from Lorraine Studio. Welcome.
I guess this is my mic. How's it going, everybody? My name is Scott Humphries. I am from Lorraine, and Lorraine is a new indie dev. We're co-located in Los Angeles and Bucharest. We were formed in August of last year, so we're pretty new. You may know or have played our first game that we released on the App Store called Link Twin. It released in February. But you may be asking, okay, why is an indie dev guy going to come up here and talk about brands? Well, before I worked for Lorraine, I worked for EA and Disney for over 12 years, actually 15 years. So I worked at EA. I was part of JAMDAT. I don't know if you guys know that company from back in the day. Feature phone development starting in 2000. And then JAMDAT got acquired by EA. So I worked for EA for about 6 years. And then I worked at Disney for 4 years and ran their co-development business. So overall, I've shipped over 50 mobile games. And a lot of the games that I've shipped have been based on big brands. And these are some of the games that I've shipped as producer or executive producer. Branding in games is really interesting. We've had some conversations here about publishers, teaming up with publishers. If you're an indie developer, I'm assuming a lot of you are indie developers, there's another route of sort of helping your game get noticed, which is tying together with a brand. However, there are certain pitfalls to take into account when you're working with a brand. And this presentation is going to cover some of the rules of the road that I think you should look for if you're going to try and attach your game to a brand. Also, some of the things that you need to be careful about, because there are things that may not be apparent to you that I've learned over the years that can be tricky. And Fernando, who was before me, if you saw his presentation, touched on brands a little bit, so it's actually a really good follow-up to what he was talking about. So I think first of all, you have to understand that brands can be of tremendous value to your product. However, brands can also bite you. And that's why you kind of need to know the right brand to go after for your game, how to go after it, the type of audience that is tied to your brand, and we're going to talk about all that stuff. But first, let's just cover this off. I want to make sure everybody understands what I'm talking to when I talk about a brand. So back in the day, the word brand came from the actual metal branding irons that ranchers would use to brand their animals when they were on the way to the slaughterhouse or the market, so the animals wouldn't get lost. And pretty soon, when consumer products started coming around and appearing in general stores back in the turn of the century, people took that idea of branding your product and putting that on the sides of soap, sundries, whatever, in the form of logos, images that would represent your product. And what happened over time is that the marketers and the ad men took those symbols and sort of created marketing and advertising around them that became more like sensibilities tied to consumers than just a brand, right? So when you look at Coke as a brand and you look at the original branding from 1910 to where we are today, they're sort of selling this sense of freedom and refreshment, and their branding message hasn't changed that much in 100 years. So they're pretty consistent. And then it's important to understand that every big brand that we know about today starts out as what we refer to as original IP or OIP. Original intellectual property, which means at some point it's not a brand. At some point it's just an idea that someone has come up with on a product. And at what point does a brand become, or does original IP become a brand? It's a function of really audience and time. And depending on the property, at the moment that it develops that brand equity is that moment when it becomes valuable to chase as a license or chase for a product on a certain platform. And depending on the media, something can start as original IP and can become a brand very quickly. So movies, I think, these days are the things that can become a brand like within a couple of weeks. Like if a movie is huge, like in the case of Frozen, that thing can become a brand and sell other products like almost immediately. Television usually takes a little bit longer because you've got single episodes. Television as a platform, I think, reaches less people as quickly. So generally, television will take a little bit longer. But once television does take off, you can get massive brands like The Simpsons or The Walking Dead, which can sell products on their own now. And I think, third is probably books, right? So books, because they're not as consumed as television and film, can take a lot longer for a brand to establish. However, all these books, and even a lot of books these days, their brand equity is increased because of their ability to move to other platforms, right? So like all of these books have been movies, and those movies have helped these brands become massive, even more so probably than the books themselves. And so in games as well, it can take time for something to become a massive brand. Sometimes it takes many, many years for something to become big, depending on the platform, or sometimes it can happen almost overnight, like in the case of Angry Birds. So video games and brands, though, have sort of had a storied past. And this is where I'm going to be focusing on, which is video games that are being created on existing brands, right? So when we talk about licensing, or we talk about a publisher coming to you and asking you to make a codev product based on their brand, that's sort of what we're going to be talking about in this presentation. So in regards to video games, you have products that have proven that a branded video game can push the medium forward, either through strong innovation, amazing storytelling, narrative that really brings value to the product. Or you've had games that have rushed to hit a movie date, or have been a cheap cash in to a current trend, and have demonstrated that brands are probably not the best path. So how do you decide whether or not to chase a brand, or what brand to chase? Well, one of my first experiences in dealing with a big brand was when I was working for JAMDAT in 2013. And for you guys that don't know, JAMDAT was one of the early mobile publishers, along with these guys, that were able to manage products in an interesting way, because they had an infrastructure of basically being able to port to all these different SKUs. And not many companies could figure that out in the early days of mobile, because everybody else had a different feature phone, whether it was Java, Brew, hundreds of different carriers. So these companies figured that out, and one of the early things that these companies did was they started going after brands, because they knew that because they had the distribution infrastructure, that a big brand would be very valuable to them and getting their product noticed. So these are some of the early branded games that I worked on when I was working on feature phones at JAMDAT. And it was because we could handle this idea of what we refer to as fragmentation. And fragmentation is the idea that you just have thousands of phones that need to be developed in order to create a business. And we're sort of getting there these days now, especially on Android, where you have to be able to manage the operational challenges of porting to a lot of different SKUs in order to manage that business effectively. So this game was massive. And JAMDAT ended up buying a company called Blue Lava Wireless that had the exclusive rights to Tetris on mobile. And they bought that company for $137 million in 2005. And all the investors thought they were crazy. Like, what are you guys doing buying a license for $137 million? That's insane. But the interesting thing was, because of JAMDAT's ability to handle fragmentation and the infrastructure of mobile, and because one of the things that this game was perfect for was the platform. It was the perfect license for a mobile phone that, back in the day, you have to remember, they didn't have touchscreens. They had keypads and D-pads. And what games and licenses are going to work really well when you just have a D-pad, and this was the perfect choice. So because of this game was the perfect choice for the platform, and because of JAMDAT's ability to handle the infrastructure of mobile, EA ended up buying JAMDAT for $680 million. That turned out to be a good investment for them. the infrastructure of EA Mobile's team today is based on the core team of JAMDAT that they hired back in 2005. So we're going to fast forward a bunch. That was my last sort of old school reminisce moment. We're going to start talking about some things when free-to-play emerged. So through this time, the iPhone appears, Google Play appears, smartphones are in mass, and the free-to-play sort of phenomenon that has been famous in Asia and to some extent PC in the US with things like Neopets has now found its way to mobile. And this transition, if you guys were around in this transition, was probably one of the craziest transitions because you had this movement of going from paid product, fire and forget, to games as service, free to play, which is a completely different beast. And at EA, we created some games, and we were just tracking what everybody else was doing. We were making original IP, right? Because that's what was working on Facebook. There were no brands really on Facebook. So we had made some games, some free to play games that were all failures. None of them just worked at all. I think, to a certain extent, we started to understand the business as we were making these games. And as we started looking at the marketplace, in 2009 on the App Store, there were 0 free-to-play games in the top 10 grossing games of that year. In 2010, there was 1 top 10 grossing game, and it was Zombie Farm. And then in 2011, there were 7. So we knew that this business model was here to stay, and there was something else that was very interesting about 2011 was that there was this brand. And this game was massive. I think this was like the number 2 game that year, grossing, and it was the Smurfs. And it's interesting to think about the Smurfs, especially from a global perspective. I know they're pretty big in Europe, but I wouldn't consider them like a top-tier brand by any means. It was just the fact that they had a brand and people were flocking to it. And they had really nailed the gameplay of like managing your own Smurfs village. So we were looking into that really closely at EA, and a light bulb went off in our head, and we were like, oh, maybe we should try bringing some of our big brands to the table and making free-to-play games based on those. And so one of the games I worked on was The Simpsons Tapped Out. And we launched that game in March of 2012.
Oh, dear. I'm outside. Where'd inside go? What? Why are you doing this to me? Because if I tap you 10 times in this game, I get free donuts. Are you saying I'm not real? I'm just a character in a game, and there are free donuts? Mm-hmm. Let's do this, giant me!
Download The Simpsons Tapped Out for free and tap Homer 10 times in a row. In addition to in-game donuts, you'll receive a special bonus decoration.
This game is life-ruiningly fun.
So this was a license. EA didn't own the rights to this brand. We had made a couple of games on console, you might remember, with this brand. So we had a relationship with the brand holder, which was Fox Gracie. And this was the first free-to-play game that we were signing up for. So I could go into an entire presentation on the process of developing this game, which was arduous, to say the least. But one thing I do want to talk about is sort of the visibility this game had on it at launch. And one of the problems was that when we first launched this game, we started encountering some technical issues. And you guys may have remembered this if you've played this game during the first launch period was we did a 4-day geo beta, a 4-day soft launch, just to sort of make sure the back-end tech would hold up. How many of you guys think a 4-day soft launch is enough time? It's not enough time. So, it was one of our biggest and first free-to-play games, and we really didn't know any better as a team. So what we didn't do is we didn't appropriately system test this game. And it was basically the back end. There was no way it was going to handle the massive amount of users that came out on day one. This game went to number 1 almost in every single territory on day one. So we started getting a server error, and this was a server error message that we were expecting to get. It was a queue system that we had just in case we started hitting mass bandwidth on the server. So we're like, okay, this is fine. We're expecting this to happen. It's no reason to panic.
Oh, come on.
And then there's this message, and this is not a message that you want to see in our game. This is basically a message where the client can't even communicate with the server. So this means like the server's not responding in any way, which means something's gone terribly wrong. And a little bit of a side note, like we thought it would be funny to put like Bart pulling a cord out of the wall for this error message. Turns out users don't want you to joke around when they can't play the game. So that's just like a side learning for you guys. We got tons of reviews that were like, that Bart message of pulling the cord out of the wall, get it out of here, I hate it. So we knew we had a serious problem. And because this was a brand and because there was a ton of focus on it, everybody picked it up. Like, oh, EA stumbled, they launched their biggest game ever, and like it's a massive disaster. And unfortunately, we had to do the unthinkable because we couldn't real-time triage the back end because it was such a mess. We had to pull the game off the App Store. So at that point, I think we had gotten something like in those 3 days, like something crazy like 1 million downloads. And we knew that we had to take it off the App Store because people were just going to keep downloading it. So before we go any further, I just want to do a quick primer on free-to-play because we're going to start getting into some free-to-play specifics, and I want to make sure everybody here sort of understands how everybody kind of get free-to-play development and like the metrics and stuff. So I'll go over this pretty quickly. So on The Simpsons, we learned a lot of stuff about the key stats that you need to track during this time period, because one of the things that was great in sort of the making lemonades out of lemons sort of terminology was that we still had that massive user base that had downloaded the client in the game. So we were able to monitor them, look at their KPIs as we were triaging the back end, even though the game was off the App Store, because they still had the client on their phone. So we were able to learn all kinds of things about free-to-play in regards to the key stats to track from a free-to-play standpoint. I'm going to say just like the 3 big buckets that are important to know about that we're going to focus on are acquisition. Acquisition is your ability to track your users that are coming into the service, whether you're trying to buy those users or whether those users are coming in from an organic standpoint. It's not only important to know that you're getting users, but it's also important to know where they're coming from because they're going to have very different KPIs attached to them. Organic users that come in just by finding your game on the App Store or from unknown sources are going to have very different stats, and usually lower stats than users that you're getting from places like Facebook, because the Facebook users are targeted and they're very qualified because you know that they are a Simpsons fan, for instance, because that's why you're advertising to them, and they're going to like the Simpsons more because that's a person that you're going after. Retention is probably and arguably the most important stat to track. This is an example of a strong retention curve where you have your day one somewhere in the 40 to 45% range, and then your day 7 is in the 20 range, and then your day 30. This is an amazing one right here. Like day 30 above 15 is fantastic. So I always like to track my retention with downloads because you can see things like this. Like when you do like a download push or you do an acquisition push, you're always going to see your retention go down, because generally the scale of the users or the quality of the users goes down, especially if you do an incentivized user acquisition push. So I always like to see retention aligned with downloads. And then monetization. I know that some people call it ARPU. I like to call it ARPDAU. Depends on who you are, but it's just average revenue per DAU. This is important to track because it will tell you the health of your daily monetization. Conversion is a product of ARPDAU. Average revenue per paying user is a product of ARPDAU. Does anybody have any ideas why that it might spike? Like the ARPDAU might spike right there? Any? Yeah. New content, close, very close. It was a limited time event. So it was an event that we ran on the weekend, and this is basically Saturday, Sunday, Monday. So running LTV, and we'll talk about LTE, limited time events, is something that works really great in regards to free-to-play monetization. We'll talk a little bit about that later when we talk about Frozen Freefall. So, long story short, we ended up optimizing the game, fixing the back end, spending about 6 months doing this with that very dedicated user base, and relaunching the game onto the app stores in August of 2012. Woohoo! And it was a massive success, and it's the game that you guys all know today. I think to this day, it might be Sims Free Play because I don't have access to the numbers, but it's either Sims Free Play or Simpsons Tapped Out are the number one grossing free-to-play games that EA has released. And outside of sort of the live ops side of this game, I think it's interesting to know one thing in regards to the brands you guys are going after. If you're going after brands, is that your gameplay style needs to match the brand that you're chasing. That's probably the most important thing that I can tell you. Most often than not, the reason a branded game fails is either because the brand isn't super relevant and just nobody cares about it, or people do care about it and the gameplay choice that developers make for that brand is the wrong choice. Now, I think The Simpsons is a fantastic example of a gameplay choice that matched the brand perfectly, and what I'm going to refer to as player aspiration. When you watch The Simpsons, or if you're a Simpsons fan, you really want to be able to interact with all those characters, interact with Springfield, which is almost like a character itself. And the idea to sort of take an established gameplay genre, which remember was not super innovative. This game isn't doing anything more innovative than, say, like a Farmville was at the time, or even a Smurfs Village was at the time. But what we were able to do was we were able to take that gameplay mechanic and tie it to the brand in a way that players really wanted to experience in a very authentic way. So we were able to bring the Simpsons writers in, and we were able to bring the Simpsons VO in, and we were able to bring the artists in to really create this authentic Simpsons experience. And when you're looking at your brands, you need to make sure that your brand and your gameplay choice overlap as much as possible in sort of the Venn diagram style, so you can really hone in on your player aspiration. And player aspiration, in my opinion, is when the gameplay and the fantasy matches the player's desires. And we're going to talk about a couple of real-world examples right now in that regard. So, Pokemon Go and Pokemon Shuffle, they're both free-to-play mobile games on the App Store. One has been extremely successful. One has not been very successful. And I think the reason that Pokemon Go has been extremely successful is because of the player aspiration. It really ties that brand to what you want to do as a player, which is what every kid who grew up with Pokemon wants to do, and go hunt Pokemon in the real world. And there had been other geolocated games in the past that are quite frankly more technically complicated and more feature rich than Pokemon Go that were never successful. So when everybody says, oh, this is a product of the brand, yes, but it's also a product of the gameplay matching the brand in the right way. 2, Star Wars. I can't even count the amount of Star Wars games on the App Store right now, and I worked at Disney. But 2 that I wanted to bring up specifically were 2 that were kind of released around the same time period by 2 big teams. Galaxy Heroes was EA, and Star Wars Uprising was Kabam. Very, very accomplished teams with a lot of success. But Galaxy of Heroes was the one that really excelled in regards to monetization and in regards to engagement and people just wanting to download it. And I think it's because it did what people want to do with a Star Wars game, which is collect all those awesome characters and fight with them, right? Star Wars Uprising created a single-player story with new characters that nobody knew about. And it's cool. I mean, it's a cool game. And look, I love Knights of the Old Republic, and that's that type of game. But this audience, a mobile audience, is more interested in sort of collecting those famous Star Wars characters and fighting with them. And I think that's why that one was more of an aspirational connection for users. And then these two games, they didn't release around the same time. Angry Birds Epic, I think, was maybe a year ago, 2 years ago, maybe. And then Angry Birds Blast just released, and Angry Birds Blast, I think, has probably become Rovio's most successful, or is on the track to become Rovio's most successful puzzle game, maybe after Stella, or it's close. It's on the way, yeah. Angry Birds Epic didn't do so well, and I think, again, this is player aspiration, right? Like when you think about Angry Birds and the brand that those guys created, it's more casual. You kind of want to be freeing birds by popping bubbles. You don't necessarily want to see the birds in armor, in turn-based RPG. So, I think I give credit to Rovio for like trying something new, and like that's really cool to think about. Like maybe there's a way to go after a new audience. But at the end of the day, I think mobile audiences are pretty simple to understand in regards to what they want, as long as you know what your audience is looking for. One other thing I want to talk about is a big brand doesn't necessarily mean that you have a big audience. So when I worked at Disney, after EA, I went to Disney because my experience on The Simpsons kind of showed me that like branded free-to-play games were the future. Like there was a huge opportunity to create free-to-play games based on big brands, and where better to go than Disney, that has like probably the largest brand catalog under the sun. One thing I didn't understand when I went to Disney that I learned when I was there is that not every brand should be a free-to-play game, and I'll tell you why. So one of the games one of the very first games that we shipped was a game called My Muppet Show. And we did it with a very successful team by the name of Big Blue Bubble out of Canada that had a game called My Singing Monsters. And My Singing Monsters, I think, has done north of $100 million or something. And when we got a hold of them, we were probably about 3 months into their launch. So like the game was successful, but we didn't know how successful it was going to be. But we thought we had a good team and they understood monetization, and let's tie that sort of conceit with the Muppets. Because you got My Singing Monsters, and the Muppets like to make music, and you want a collection mechanic, and there's like tons of Muppets you can collect. It's like, it seems like the right fit from a player aspiration standpoint, right? In addition to that, we had the first movie, which launched in 2012, which was very successful, critically received, box office financially did pretty good. There was a second movie that was in development that was going to release in 2013, kind of around the time frame when we want to release this game. This brand had been around for 30 years. So we're like, brand equity, yes, right? Like we finally got a good brand. We're going to be able to make some good stuff. There's got to be a ton of people around. So in August 2013, we launched it.
Put it all together now. Yeah. Okay. Put it all together now. All right. Waka.
So we started doing some KPI evaluations, and we saw some really great metrics in this game. Day one was amazing. Our conversion was higher than expectations. Normally, you're looking for like a 1.5 conversion in a successful free-to-play game, so hitting like 2% was like awesome. And then our ARPDAU was pretty high for a casual game, so we were very stoked. And then we're like, okay, well we've got the metrics. Let's start throwing some money into advertising, right? Because like this is the free-to-play is like you got the metrics, put money in. And as long as the money that you put in is lower than your LTV, then this is the best business in the world, right? So we created some creatives to put on Facebook. And it was interesting because since My Singing Monsters was also live, they were running very similar creatives, right? They were doing what worked. And we were running these creatives at the same time. The interesting thing is on My Muppet Show, back in the day, this was 2013, we had a $2.33 CPI, which isn't that much for these days. But back then it was a little high, and we're like, okay, that's kind of crazy. A little higher than expected. The interesting thing was My Singing Monsters, a game that had been out for, at this time, probably about 8 months and had about 6 million users was getting a lower CPI than the Muppets game. And if you guys don't know what CPI is cost per install. It's sort of the thing that you measure your advertising money against. So like you want your CPI to be lower than your LTV because that's how you make money, right? If like your advertising costs more than your LTV, then you're losing money. So unfortunately, with the CPI in that game, we were sort of losing money because we weren't able to get the users in that we needed. So we knew that we had to fix something, but it was also very strange that My Singing Monsters had a lower CPI, and we really couldn't figure it out. Why would a game that was brand new, that was based on a massive brand, have a higher CPI than a game that was original IP and had been out for 8 months and arguably a bit of a saturated user base, right, from the marketing. And this sort of came to me as we were working on this game, was when we thought the game had brand equity, it actually had something that I'm going to refer to as brand debt. And brand debt is this term that I learned when I was at Disney, mainly around this product, where the wrong brand can actually narrow your audience. And what that basically means is that when you think about a brand, you need to think about the audience and who would be interested in sort of playing a mobile game based on that brand. And in the situation of the Muppets, it just turned out that while we had overlapped the genre and the brand pretty well, and the gameplay and the brand, the overlap of the audience and sort of people that wanted to play a mobile game based on that brand was really small and quite niche. So this was a real problem for us, and eventually the game ended up being taken off the App Store because we just couldn't get users in, while My Singing Monsters, which was an original IP, had no problem getting users in with an original art style and original characters. So it's really interesting to think about when you guys go after brands, is there also that audience overlap for the platform that you're working in? So luckily, one game that we did launch at Disney that did have a pretty big overlap was Frozen Freefall. And the funny story about Frozen Freefall is that when we were working on Frozen Freefall in 2013, Disney didn't think that it was going to be successful or as successful as it became. You have to remember back then, Pixar was still the darling of Disney. Disney Animation had done, Tangled and Wreck-It Ralph, which had done pretty well, but not near the level of Pixar releases. So there wasn't a lot of expectations on how this movie was going to perform. Now, my team jumped at the chance to be able to work on a new Disney property, and you have to remember that, back then, it was an original IP. It wasn't a brand yet. So like I said, it was an original IP, but at what point did Frozen go from original IP to massive brand? I can tell you exactly when that happened. Here's the App Annie rankings of our app. And you can sort of see like launches over here, and we were in decline. And we were spending money on user acquisition, and it just seemed like we weren't getting enough traction. The KPIs were pretty good for a puzzle game. And then Apple released the digital SKU like a month early than DVD. I don't know if you guys remember that, but they did. And we didn't do any marketing, and it just went boom. And here, it started to drop a little bit, but generally past here, it's sort of sustained for at least another couple years. So for Frozen, it took 3 months for the game, for the movie to become a massive brand, and we rode that massive brand for the next couple years. Now, while we were given the audience by the brand, it wasn't only the audience coming in that made the product a success. And I want you guys to understand that. So just because you get a massive amount of eyeballs and downloads because of a brand doesn't mean it's going to make your game successful. You also have to make sure you understand how to manage the product from a live ops standpoint. And there were some things that we did on Frozen that really catered to the audience in a really strong way from a live ops standpoint. So one of the things that we did that was very innovative for the time was that we added new mechanics each update. Typically what King had been doing and some of the other puzzle games that they had been sort of recycling the existing mechanics and sort of creating emergent gameplay out of different mechanics in levels. And we wanted to make sure that every single update we introduced a new thing. So users would come back and they would be, now you've got to play with the wolves mechanic, where the wolves are going to move around the board and they're going to switch the tiles around. Or now we're introducing the marshmallow mechanic, and marshmallow is going to come in every 5 moves and freeze some of your pieces. And it really trained our user base to knowing that, it took us a little longer to do updates. We ideally would have liked to get updates out like in the sort of the 3-week time frame, but we're probably around the 6-week time frame because we're doing all this heavy lifting in regards to mechanics. But what it did do is it trained the users to come back for something fresh and new every update, and that really made the retention of this game skyrocket. One of the other things, innovations that we did, and I still don't see enough people doing this, so this is actually probably a good thing to try out in your free-to-play games, is a combination of durable and consumable purchases. So typically in a puzzle game, you have all consumable purchases, and consumable purchase refers to the fact that everything that you buy eventually goes away, and you need to buy more stuff like energy or power-ups or coins. One of the interesting things that we did in this game, and we tried it out, was that we created this mechanic where if you finish the core map, which I think was like 250 levels or something, if you finish the core map, we'd slowly start releasing new maps, seasonal maps or special event maps. And if you had finished that core map, you could play those maps for free. If you were stuck somewhere in the core map, then you could buy access to the new maps for $1.99. If you just kind of wanted to play both at the same time. And this was really interesting because what we did is we unlocked a whole new player base. We unlocked about, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I want to say it was about maybe another like 1 to 2% of people that had not spent ever. So it was pretty awesome in that we had converted, and this was like opened up our monetization pretty significantly. And that was 1 to 2% a day. And I think it's because some people just, maybe back then didn't want to pay for consumables. Some people just want things that stick around more. And it's just a different philosophy of your purchasers. And the other one was limited time events, which we were talking about earlier. Limited time events drove our revenue by about 200%. And we did it in a really cool way. Like one of our first events that we ran was Elsa's Ice Castle, where we basically said, you have to finish these 5 levels, you'll get an interim reward, and then if you finish these 5 levels, you get a bigger reward. And it really drove people to want to get that reward. And at the end of the day, the funny thing was the majority of them ended up spending more money on power-ups to get here than the value of the reward, just because they wanted to build Elsa's Ice Castle and get to the end of it. So this was a really great feature. And as you saw sort of the brand declining over the years, right? And this is like 2015 and 2016. The movie had been out for a couple years, and not many people cared about it anymore. We ran the event system, and the event system basically was able to carry the brand forward for many, many years. And the reason is because we were able to use a lot of brand synergy, which is also something that you can bring to the table, right? Disney, while they didn't have a new movie, they were doing like shorts on the Disney Channel. They were coming out with new toys. So we were able to tie a lot of those events to things that Disney was doing and the brand was doing to be able to basically sustain the service. Another game that does this really well is Marvel's Contest of Champions, and they're basically able to sustain the service of their game with every single movie that releases. They release new events, they release new icons, they basically do a completely new game reskin. Now, every brand's not Marvel, and you're not going to be able to do this for everything, but it is important to think about if you're chasing a brand, what are sort of the synergy moments that you can use to spike your events and carry the game's longevity through. So this game spawned 2 other games in the series. Neither of them were as successful as Frozen Freefall, but they helped to extend the service, and we were able to basically funnel users back and forth. So through Disney, we were able to create a sub-brand, which was Freefall, that was able to add value to sort of this puzzle platform. So I think, The other thing I want to mention is in regards to audience, and this is close to the final thing. Not only understand sort of the gameplay, but understand the audience that comes with your brand. Does your audience play games, right? I think like there's a Downton Abbey game that released, and Downton Abbey was a huge brand, but nobody played that game because I doubt there's like a lot of overlap between Downton Abbey and people that want to play games. So there's a lot of things to think about when you're going after a brand, looking at the audience and figuring out if there's that overlap. Does your audience overlap with the genre you've chosen, right? It's like Angry Birds and turn-based RPG, or Angry Birds and casual puzzle game. And then what's your audience age? So a lot of people will jump in with companies like Mattel or Hasbro and make a game based on a toy franchise, like My Little Pony or something like that. One thing you have to understand is if you're focusing on a kid's brand, you're going to run into significant challenges in regards to monetization unless you're thinking outside the box and doing things like advertising or video or subscription. So one of the experiences that I have, and here's some games that I think have struggled in regards to the wrong genre for the wrong audience, right? Like Night at the Museum was a family movie, but it was a hidden object game, right? And like I can't imagine a lot of kids are like reading clues and trying to find them in the hidden object game format. Zootopia was a game we worked on at Disney, which was the same problem. That game skewed super young. We were hoping that it would come out and it would age up a little bit, but it didn't. And then Boof Pop was a match 3 puzzle game, which is, everybody should know it's primarily females, 35 to 55, right? And they ended up getting a really young audience into that game because it was based on an animated cartoon. So one game I have in particular to cite this experience for is Big Hero 6. And I feel like we created a pretty awesome game for Big Hero 6. It was essentially a puzzle RPG, but I'll tell you why that didn't do so well.
When danger threatens the city, only one team can save the day. Join Hero and Baymax on a match 3 adventure. Collect hundreds of bots, evolve them to their highest form, team up with your favorite heroes, save San Francisco, and kick some butt.
So this game, we were so excited about this game. I can't quote the full forecast for this game, but they were pretty massive because we had Gumi on board, who had done Brave Frontier. They were making this game for us. They were a fantastic team. They did a fantastic job in creating a Puzzle and Dragons / Marvel Puzzle Quest type game. The problem was that when we were in soft launch before the movie, we saw some concerning stats. And one of the good things that we had at Disney is we had age gates at Disney because we had to put age gates on for COPPA. If you guys don't know what COPPA is, it's basically a group that monitors what's okay for kids and what kids can be doing in a game. And because we were family IP, we had to put age gates in and age gate out some of the content that would be like Facebook, right? Because you don't want kids under 13 connecting to Facebook, even if they have an account. So basically we had to age gate the game and some of the features in the game. And what we found was that even before the movie release, we had 25% of our users, which was under 13. And this is like a pretty hardcore free-to-play game. I mean, it's essentially Puzzle & Dragons. Like, it's all based on bot collection, RPG upgrading, soft currencies, right? When the movie released, it went through the roof, and we had almost half of our users were under 13. So we were like, oh, shit. And at this point, like, this is where the brand bites you because there's nothing you can do. Like, we struggled a lot with this game. We're like, well, let's make it more casual. That didn't work. Well, let's take the brand out and let's just call it Bot Fight. And of course, we couldn't do that because everything was already Big Hero 6. So this was a real problem for us, and we ended up spending, over a year and a half on this game, and it just died at the moment it released. It's important to understand if you guys go after a brand that can have kids come in, that it will affect your retention. Your retention will be bad, and it will be all over the place if it's an adult genre. If it's a kid's genre, like Crossy Road, so Disney Crossy Road is sort of the opposite of this. Like Disney Crossy Road had awesome retention because it was made for kids, right? So you just have to think about, again, the audience and the games you're making. And I'm getting the cutoff sign. I'm almost there, almost. And the other thing to think about is your young audience will affect monetization in all genres, right? So unless you can think outside the box in order to monetize kids, kids are just not going to spend like adults. They just don't. That's why you don't see any kids games in top grossing ever. And even in Disney Crossy Road, we had to monetize through durables because that's typically how kids monetize, because they have to go to their parents and say, "Mommy, will you buy this for me?" And parents don't like to hear, "Buy me 100 gems and 100 coins." They like to hear, "Will you buy me Mickey Mouse?" or "Will you buy me," things that are a little more tangible and have value. So what I would say is watch out for the uncasual valley, and this is my term. I call it the uncasual valley, which is a play on words for the uncanny valley. If you guys don't know what the uncanny valley is, it's sort of that term of like CG not matching closely to humans and the people trying to make it look like humans, and it just feels weird. So this is my term for like you're trying to make a core game, but your audience is actually casual and you're falling here, right? Which means you have no audience that wants to play your genre and you make no money. So be careful of that. All right, so summary. Brand equity is key in any brand you're going after. Make sure it's there if you're chasing it. Otherwise, you're not going to have the value that you're looking for. Brand should be platform fit. Make sure that it's a game that people want to play on mobile and it's a game people can play on mobile. Be ready for the extra attention you're going to get, like in the case of The Simpsons, if something goes wrong, good or bad. Gameplay and player aspiration is probably the most important thing. So if you're going to go after a brand, think of a gameplay connection that fits really well. Some brands can narrow your audience versus original IP. So if you're really going after a brand, think if it can add value to the type of product you're making versus just going original IP. Brands bring the audience, but live ops bring the success. So just because you have a brand doesn't mean you're going to have a successful game. And then beware the uncasual valley. That's it. Thank you very much.
We still have a little bit time for questions. Any questions from the audience after such an interesting presentation? Anybody? Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I see that you mainly launch the games before actually launching the movies. So is it a marketing effort to market the movies themselves? Why do you guys do that?
No. So no game has ever sold a movie. That's a term that we would use all the time when we were at Disney, right? It was like the amount of eyeballs on a game is never going to make people go watch the movie. But the reason we would launch with movies is because the movie studios would be doing tons of marketing at that point. They would be on billboards, they would be on bus stops, they would be on TV. So as people were sort of going on the App Store and looking for stuff, those games would have a chance to spike because people might be searching for those products just naturally. So you'd get an automatic marketing boost. However, these days, many companies are not even looking to release a game with the movie if the game's not ready. Because the highest success that you can have with a free-to-play or live ops game is making sure that your KPIs are where they need to be before worldwide launch. And if you launch that product too early just to hit a movie date, the chances of you pulling out of a ditch in regards to your KPIs, even with that marketing push and those users, is really tough. Because even though you get the users, if your day one retention isn't there, they're gone. Like most of them are gone in one day. So the game is the most important, but the movie is good because you can get the spike in marketing if it's ready.
How do you feel about mobile games becoming movies, i.e. Angry Birds?
I think it's awesome and kind of crazy. Look, I've been working on mobile games, like I said, for 15 years. Like when I started working on mobile games, people would look down on me. They were like, we were making games on Java phones, like shitty little Java phones on 64K devices. Like I had to make games that fit into 64K of a binary. And when we got bought by EA, we were kind of like, looked down upon as like, what are those guys doing? And now these days, like you can't think of including mobile games in sort of the pantheon of successful entertainment media. I mean, the slide Fernando showed earlier shows that the App Store revenue has bypassed entertainment industry revenue in regards to movies this year. So I think it's only a matter of time that these big brands that have so many eyeballs on mobile, I mean, I don't know how many people have played Angry Birds in the billions, but, you know, having a brand that has billions of invested people in it and bringing that to another platform just makes sense. Warcraft, same thing, right? Like Warcraft, you know, arguably not a very good movie, but like massive properties killed it, especially overseas in the territories where Warcraft is super popular. So I think it's just makes sense. It's going to happen. It's going to happen more and more.
Okay, one last question. Anybody?
Cool. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate you giving me the time.
Thank you.